The only other thing I would say at the onset is that since we're a room full of teachers, and I know a few of the folks in the room, like those sisters in the back corner over there, who are master teachers, and I'm sure there are a lot more in here who fit that description. There's probably some shared expertise in the room around some of these things. The world history question, I think, Professor Lowen has just laid it out. Only other thing I would say in terms of curriculum writing, one of the first nut we tried to crack when we were writing curriculum around the high school course in Philly was how do we get young people to invest in the conversation. Every time I hear we, I bristle because I ain't nothing to do with it. And when I think of, for example, the Cuban-Spanish-American War, I'm thinking about the way Faulkner would narrate that. Cubans trying to get rid of the Spanish. America jumps in thinking it's going to get a quick bargain on the cheap. The question becomes, who are the black soldiers to themselves, and who are they to other people? The first thing we tried to do with the curriculum was jailbreak the paradigm, jailbreak the model. So when you sit in a classroom with a young person who already feels some social distance from this concept of America, rather than keep pressing it on them to act like they got to own these crimes because of this fictional nation-state entity, we did this, we did that, and they sitting there like, I ain't had nothing to do with that. No, we didn't do nothing. I joined the Army to fight my way out of slavery. Then the 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th, 25th Regiment, so-called Buffalo Soldiers, you don't get mustered out. Why did those black soldiers stay in the Army during Reconstruction? A lot of people in this room already know the answer to that. Why if you're talking to a 5th grader or a 9th grader or a 3rd grader, would you ask her, why would you stay in the Army after you fought your way out of slavery? What would some of the answers be, you think? Huh? It's a job, food, plus they teach them how to read. A lot of the school teachers, Carl G. Woodson's uncles, military guys, they come out of the war and they become the school teachers in Virginia that teach Woodson and his siblings how to read. Because, his mother and father couldn't. I'm saying all that to say that these are the classroom conversations, but to bring it out and then we'll continue, maybe have some more conversation, we get some more people commenting and have a conversation. When you ask about this in the context of world history, I think it becomes a question of, we know what's on the test. We know that a lot of times we can learn incidental to the stuff that's on the test by putting it in the context of things that are interesting to us, right? So that if the Spanish-American War is on the test, the question becomes, where do I come in? And I come in because I stayed in the Army long enough that I was getting ready to retire. They sent me to Cuba, and I saw this cat that looked just like my brother, except he spoke Spanish. And then you return to very much to a classroom in D.C., Maryland, or Virginia. Like, anybody here speak Spanish? Any Cubans in here? Puerto Ricans, Dominicans? All right. What would you do if you looked and everybody kept their mouth shut and somebody here looked just like you and you try to speak to them and they speak to you in English, you can't speak Spanish? In other words, you begin to humanize it, and then what happens is they begin to understand the unit when you start talking about something like a smoked Yankee, which is what the Cubans started calling the African Americans in the 1890s, right? 1898, 1899. But what that means is on the American history test, if you're teaching high school, the AP may be something about remembering the Maine, and maybe they're talking about William Randolph Hearst and the Splendid Little War. All that stuff you memorize incidental to the conversation you having. It's like a nuisance, you just remember, oh yeah, that's what, because the category we established was who are Africans to other people, just like today. And then they understand, okay, I got to learn this because that's a test. I didn't make up the test, but I can figure it out. But what I'm more interested in is why all these black people call Maceo now. Because Antonio Macheo, the Bronze Titan in the Cuban-Spanish-American War, was the black dude that was helping fight against colonialism, and the black soldiers down there were like, oh, this is our man. So when they came back, they mispronounced the name, but they named everybody Maceo. But that becomes an interesting conversation, and the test stuff becomes an interruption in the conversation, and incidental. And then they don't resent it. At least that's what I think we began to try to pilot, that kind of thing. And to me, that kind of works better. But I'd really be interested in hearing how educators think about this in terms of how we approach learning so that we don't decenter the human into learning so people feel bad about themselves as they learn in this material.
Let me say just one word about that, and then maybe you guys can think about what you want to say or ways you teach things or questions you have, whatever. But you just got in by a different route than I've ever used, to the principle that I always begin my teacher workshops with. And my principle is that you cannot teach the textbook. Okay, I'm the only person in the United States that's ever read these textbooks. And among other things, I know this to be true because it took years of psychotherapy to get over it. But besides that, one of the ways I really know it to be true is because when I was writing the second edition of Lies My Teacher Told Me, and we sociologists count things, I learned from that the average U.S. history textbook for high school had grown from 888 pages to now 1,152 pages. Now, there's no excuse for that, because back in 1960, or 1860, come to think of it, but back in 1960, if you're teaching in a little bitty village in South Dakota, you don't got no resources for U.S. history other than your textbook. You don't even have a community library. But now every hamlet in America is connected to the Library of Congress. It's connected to something called the World Wide Web. I think you've probably heard of it. And there's just a lot of stuff to use there, and we need a 300-page paperback. And instead, we now have 1,152 pages. Well, that's terrible enough, but two of the 6 new ones that I read for the second edition of Lies My Teacher Told Me, 2 of them, for page after page toward the last part of the book, are identical, even though they're by 2 completely different sets of authors. How could that be? I mean, this is the biggest cheating scandal in the history of American history, I mean, some of these people, what's her name? Who's the redheaded woman historian that got in trouble for plagiarism, or Stephen Ambrose got in trouble. He didn't use enough footnotes, okay? But we're not talking about footnotes and stuff like that. We're talking about identical pages for page after. How could this happen? Well, it's because none of the authors of these textbooks write anything. They rent their names, all right? And what Prentice Hall did was they rented the names of Burston and Kelly, Daniel Burston, famous men here in this city. He was the Librarian of Congress. Brooks Mather Kelly, the archivist of Yale University. They wrote, by which I mean did not write, one history textbook that is still for sale, even though both of them are dead. And these other 4 people, including for the modern era, a professor whose title is Distinguished Professor of History at Miami University of Ohio, they wrote, by which I mean did not write, Pathways to the Present, okay, another textbook. Only instead of hiring 2 flacks to write the 2 different textbooks, Prentice Hall saved a little money and just hired one and used it twice. Okay? And that's how come I discovered it. Now, how come I know nobody else ever read these books? Because there's reading committees, there's textbook committees all over the United States. Half of our states adopt statewide. The rest of them adopt district-wide. They're all reading these 2 books, but they don't read them, and I don't blame them. They're so boring. That's why it took so much psychotherapy. So your job is not to read and teach the textbook. Your job is to use the textbook on occasion to teach history, right? And sometimes you're going to be wanting to teach against the textbook, using some of this stuff that we're giving you about Reconstruction.
Technology.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted Deborah Menkart with Teaching for Change and the Zen Education Project. And the session, thanks to our talented moderator or participants or speakers, got started. We did want to formally begin making sure that each had a time to talk and then have some time for Q&A from the audience. And so thank you, everybody, for selecting this session. As I noted, we're also recording it. We have, you want to introduce yourself in the back? Taylor Moore, doing our recording, who's also a college student. And so if anybody, we will send the link out to everybody afterwards. So I did want to, should we back up and do introductions, or is everybody here because they know who they came to hear? Probably everybody's here because they know who they came to hear. So I do want to make sure that we get a chance to hear a little bit from each of you and then some time to open it up for questions and answers. And so I think since I just heard Dr. Lowen speaking, Dr. Carr, if you wanted to speak for a little bit about your thoughts about what people should know about Reconstruction, and then we can open it up for Q&A.
Sure. Very quickly, I'll make this quick so we can continue the conversation. Yeah, we were determined to break that rule there, but I can't hold order on Professor Lowen. He's the elder, so he said, we're going to do this. And so we launched into this conversation a few minutes ago, talking about, obviously, the period from the end of the Civil War until traditionally 1876, the election of 1876. We know that's the dates of Reconstruction. No need to go over that. As I think, for me, thinking about this is really about the project of, well, the American experiment. But the American experiment in a much larger context, the context of human society. What does it mean to be human in the world? What does it mean to build community? That's a kindergarten class. That's a first grade class. What does it mean to be in this community? Why are you crying? Are you sleepy? You hungry? Everything good? We're building community all the time. What does it mean to be brought into a community as not a human being? We got a community here except you. And because you're not human, we're human. If you leave, somebody got to take your spot. So in other words, what does it mean to build a society around an exception? That's what America is. It's a settler colony. It is a settler colony like everything else on this side of the ball. So I think about Du Bois, who was saying basically in Black Reconstruction, there are no complete heroes. There are no complete villains. This is a story about human beings. Of course, he's using the language of that he was brought and raised in, the language of man. So he says, you know, it's just man. Well, we're going to have to update that. They're just people, right? So with that point of departure, the question becomes, what can we do to be a different society in the future than we are now? And that starts with the society in the classroom. What can we model in here that we might be able to extend out of here? Because for this moment we're all together, we're going to be a society. So that might start at the lower grades with coming up with some rules. Everybody in here has done that many times. How are we going to build these consensuses, right? So we start talking about Reconstruction, that's basically the rules for American society. You got a constitution. So for me, Reconstruction really starts with the rules for American society. And those rules don't start with the Constitution. Those rules start with the settler colony agreements in the various colonies. John Locke is drafting stuff that ends up being North Carolina. Maryland's an experiment in Catholicism. Georgia is the Australia of the British colonies. That's where you dump all the convicts. In other words, they're all different from each other. That's going to become important during Reconstruction, because you can be very magnanimous in Maine, although we hear perhaps New England isn't that magnanimous, because that's where General Howard is from, the Christian general, who's then chasing Native Americans during Reconstruction, but we'll get to that, because I would love for them to change the name of this university. But we can't get there until we understand how you build human community, and part of building human community is I am a human being, which means I have the right to build consensus to rename everything if I want to. Because if America is truly experiment, everything should be negotiable except the idea that we're all humans, right? So anyway, very quickly, starting with the colonial models in these laboratories, and then realizing that you got Spain, you got England, you got France primarily, and they're tussling with each other. This is where I think the work of Gerald Horne comes in very usefully. Maybe not an elementary school classroom or even a high school classroom, but as teachers reading something like the Counter-Revolution of 1776, to understand that this is a lot of different people from a lot of different places racing over to get these resources, who are making it up as they go along. The one thing they agree on, that, as James Baldwin would say, they are not, thank heaven, you, meaning what? The Native Americans. Well, what's a Native American? You can't ask them. A Creek is not a Chickasaw, it's not a Cherokee, and the Seminoles is basically a political configuration. I mean, they basically make up an ethnicity in part because they're resisting oppression. So all this is being made up in real time. Bring us to a conclusion, then we can kind of open up and have a conversation. By the time, as Gerald writes, these 13 British colonies realize that England is debating whether or not maybe to abolish the slave trade in some of these places, because maybe the mainland North America isn't as profitable. They got to hang on to their sugar colony, which is Jamaica, and maybe we'll even give some of these Negroes guns. Why? Because we just had a case in England, Somerset's case, where the judge says if it's not written down in the law explicitly, you can't enslave people. Now that sounds nice in theory, but now they get nervous over here. Why? Because the same British told them to go put the French out the Ohio Valley, and they sent George Washington out there to do it. When they come back to Virginia, they're like, now we're going to make you pay for the war. Now, but in the textbook, this is all narrated as oh, resistance, the tax rebellion, wait, no. This is an experiment in humanity. Who are people to each other? I'm saying all that to say that when they decide to engage in what Gerald called the counter-revolution of 1776, the American Revolution, they break from England. England comes back from a rematch, and a lot of black people side with the English, right? But that's a whole nother thing, the War of 1812. I love the War of 1812. I think the War of 1812, in other words, these are the things that should be taught. We focusing on the American Revolution. No, go to the War of 1812. Tecumseh is up there in the north, like, look, let's get all the Indians together. Everybody's jostling to try to preserve their humanity. So anyway, they break, and then they start experimenting. Articles of Confederation, then they come with the Constitution. James Madison say, oh, what about the people, the individuals? Oh, yeah, Bill of Rights, that's important, yeah. The Constitution is basically a contract document. It's about property, it's about rights. The question, the idea that our humanity will be an afterthought or not be the first thing should be the thing that helps the students understand Reconstruction. Why? It's almost like if America was a car and you were starting it, the Constitution was the first attempt, and then Reconstruction, the car finally gets running. Why? Okay, and then you get to 1861, and it's like, look, this thing is not profitable anymore. We can't control these people. Certain parts of the South, it's kind of ungovernable. The Civil War is almost inevitable. John C. Calhoun has bought the whole thing. He's going to be the intellectual architect. White people are superior. Black people are not going to be satisfied. There's a whole bunch of debates going on. The Negro Convention movements have started, and free blacks are arguing. Black people in enslavement are setting it off, and that conversation is going on. The whole thing is a mess. Finally, when the Civil War jumps off, you got 4 million Africans in this country who are property, who become people, in theory, within a 6-year period. How you gonna free all these Negroes into a market economy with no money? And you said you just made by executive fiat, y'all are human. And that remains the central challenge of the American experiment. It has never been resolved, and every student understands that there's a hierarchy of humanity in America, and the only thing that holds this together is not consensus. We ain't never had no conversation about it, but it's putting them 2 letters over any conversation we have in the textbooks and the assessments and everything else, and expecting everybody to wink. We. When we fought the Germans, there's a lot of black people who were for the Japanese. When, during Reconstruction, Du Bois says in the South, public education was a Negro idea for everybody. Students then began to awaken to the concept that none of this is dry. All of this is human beings trying to work out how to create a better society. And then they began to become invested in 2 things. Number 1, understanding what happened better, but more importantly, probably number 2, trying to figure out something better now and not waiting on elites and legislators and anybody else to do it for you, because that's not American history. It never got built from the top down. The top responded always to some experiment. The populist movement, the fusion movement, we just heard Professor Lauren talking about. Those things come from the top, from the bottom up, and people say, well, how are we going to manage this? I think that becomes the framework. And so Reconstruction, to me, is the pivotal moment. I won't say to me. I shouldn't say that, because it isn't just me. Anybody who studies Reconstruction comes alive with the sense that for a moment, people were willing to try all this stuff like we could do this. And then, as Du Bois said, the Negro came out of the shadows, stood in the sun for a brief moment, turned, forced back into that shadow again. That's a hell of a metaphor. What did the sun feel like, and why can't everybody stand in the sun? The sun shine on everybody, not you. So I think that's, as a point of departure, it's very broad, but we can get very specific in terms of examples and events and dates and legislation and things like that. But to me, that's the metaphor. Build community in the classroom and build it out by using Reconstruction examples to see how people were trying to work through this very difficult problem of being human in a project that was never meant to be that project.
Right, and I think that for teachers, right, it's the story of the threat of the good example.
Yes.
That's yeah. So we got some questions, and when you say your question, maybe introduce yourself real quickly, what your role is. We're going to start here and work our way across. Okay, yeah, there we go. Yeah, you can, is the mic, Herman, is the mic?
Our colleague.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to know your thoughts on an apology that a public charter school teacher had to make last week in San Antonio, Texas, for teaching, handing out a worksheet to her students to list the pros and cons of slavery. I'd like to, her argument was she wanted to present a balanced view, so she had them list the pros and cons of slavery. Your comments, please. Thank you.
Let me make a comment on that. That was a...
Miss Helen, you introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm Helen Bond. I'm a professor here in the School of Education at Howard University. Thank you.
And that Prentice Hall is claiming that they didn't have anything to do with that, but I doubt them. That was a worksheet to accompany Borston and Kelly's book that I just badmouthed a few minutes ago, called A History of the United States. And Borston and Kelly, many of these books are called legacy books because they date back 20, 30, even 40 years, and Borston and Kelly is one of them. And so the passage on slavery in the book itself kind of does that, what you just said, kind of does that. And is therefore kind of an apologia for slavery. And Prentice Hall has to admit that they published the book at least. And the way we've taught slavery and the way some people still teach it is with some positives. Like, at least you have somebody taking care of you, you know? Nobody took care of mill workers up in the north if they lost a foot in the mill and could no longer work in the mill. They were out on their own. It was just terrible. I'm almost bringing myself to tears just thinking about it. I'm kidding. But the massa would take care of you. And you know, the mistress, her job, she was almost a nurse. Her job was kind of to be specifically minding the bodies, if you will, or the health of all of the help. This is complete BS. The main people taking care of black people in slavery were black people in slavery. They were other slaves. They were the doctors for themselves to the extent they had any. They were the midwives. They were everything else. This whole, anyway, I could go on at great length about this. When you actually read the slave narratives, and you have to read them a little bit carefully. By the slave narratives, I'm kind of referring to the WPA slave narratives, the ones taken down between 1935 and 1940. And so these are narratives of kids. That is, they were 5 years old or 10 years old when slavery ended, and we have to be aware of that. And there's some other problems with these narratives. And if you want to use this slave narrative, let me say a couple things about teaching about slavery. May I do that? I have a chapter called How to Teach Slavery in a book I wrote called Teaching What Really Happened. It's about my only book that they don't have on sale here. But you can get it, or you can get your library to get. I'm not trying to hack my books, hawk my books. But anyway, and also one other thing I wanted you to be aware of, if you type my name, let's say James W. Lowen, that is my name, come to think of it, and you type NEA, and you put that into a Google search, you will come up with 9 new essays that NEA just published on their website. And each of them is just a page and a half long. So even though you're busy teachers, and one of them is How to Teach Slavery, and it gives 2 references at the end of it for more sources on how to teach slavery. Because the key thing about slavery, well, one of the key things to teach, is that it took away human volition. So that people, namely enslaved people, couldn't do what they wanted to do the next minute, the next moment. They had to have the plantation owner's permission, except for maybe Sunday. I mean, there were some breaks, Christmas. But that's why sometimes they couldn't even do things like make a table, all right? Because he'd notice. You can make a table if I say you can make a table, but you can't make a table otherwise. And so lots of folks didn't have no table. There's all these stories in the slave narratives about slaves eating with kind of wooden paddle spoon-like things, the kids especially, eating from a trough, and even with the dogs eating with them. And we had, quote, I'm quoting one, we had to be quick or the dogs would get it all. Now, if somebody comes to a plantation and sees this going on, what are they going to think? They're going to think them black folks, they're like animals. And meanwhile, the white folks are eating like gods with crystals and chandeliers if it's a big plantation. So all of these things are ordained by the master, and there's just no two sides about it. Slavery was not this nice experience, civilizing experience, Christianizing, educational. My students, I told you before, my Turkle students said they were too soon out of slavery. Now there's a concept. These are black people saying this because they've been mistaught about slavery. You cannot be too soon out of slavery. That's impossible, okay?
Right. No. I'm thinking about this because how do we get rid of racism, sexism, militarism, capitalism, all things? There's a violence of forgetting that's perhaps an option. Or perhaps there's an acknowledgement in our humanity that our humanity is complex. John Henry Clark, the historian, used to say, in some stories, it ain't no good guys. We're human, right? So then, I guess the question for me, as you asked it, I'm thinking, my visceral response is, that teacher doesn't have to apologize to me. I want that worksheet. But how would I change it? What are the pros and cons of unfree labor? Everybody in here has been unfree labor at one time. It's called childhood. But you were a human as a child. You got room, board, somewhere, but then it's changed. Eventually you had to do some chores, you had to do something you didn't want to do. In other words, coerced labor is something we're all familiar with in one way or another, and we all get a check every week or two, not nearly enough, and in exchange for it, we do a lot of things we don't want to do. So coerced or unfree labor to me becomes then a question about, the reason, let me I'm going this and then I'll wind this up very quickly. Textbooks or lessons, anything we learn in schools, when you talk about slavery, you'll see a line perhaps that might say in many of the materials, some of the materials, much of the materials, slavery has existed in all human societies. So stop, context. What are the pros and cons? And I taught a class of comparative slavery, so I teach about every 2 or 3 years here at Howard. One of the things we start with is unfree labor arrangements in African societies. What does it mean to be a captive of war? What does it mean to have to now do what somebody else says because they beat you in a war, except then you have children and your children don't inherit your status? What are the pros and cons of unfree labor arrangements when you're talking about expanding your territory because you want to feed more people? That doesn't mean it's good or bad, but what you're beginning to understand is that people do things to other people. What makes this situation different? Now the worksheet becomes, what's the context, what's the pros and cons of it here? There are no pros when you talk about chattel slavery. Because now you're talking about dehumanization. Now you're talking about a different form. What are the pros of it? Well, who are you talking about? Well, the pros for the people who run the place are X, Y, Z. What are the pros for the people who are unfree? Well, now here's where it gets sensitive. Here's where it gets sensitive. Who in the hell said America was the greatest thing ever happened in the world, or that Western civilization was either? See, the unspoken thing is, yeah, it was bad, but damn, at least we ain't in Africa no more. And that's the thing that we really can't address because we haven't had a conversation about what makes human beings human. We see this American exceptionalism to me. Now we come into us, these adults having this conversation, teachers having this conversation. American exceptionalism to me is a real problem. For 2 reasons. Number one, I don't believe in it, but number 2, forget whether you believe in it or not. Guess who doesn't? The world. China looking like, okay, we were out for a nap, we back 300 years later, it's time to run this thing. And as this thing deteriorates, as the demography changes, and all those people who you thought believed what you believe because you said we and nobody said anything else, began to fracture. And maybe California decides to secede. And we didn't study Reconstruction, so you don't understand how fragile the states' rights argument is. Because during Reconstruction in the North, when Grant ran for president and the Republicans took the turn away from emancipation, they were hell on the South because they wanted to break the South. But those voting rights in the North began to erode for black people, black men. And they were willing to sacrifice the Negroes in the North. Why? Because again, this is regions and states. And so long story short, that worksheet for me, if it's worked right, becomes a conversation about what it means to be human and do things to other human beings and what happened here that we need to finally face and address because some people, quite frankly, are grateful for slavery. They hate the lash, they hate the lynching, but if you told them today we could reverse all this, but the price would be you might not be here, well, it was bad, but look how far we've come. A people's journey. Where my man, where Paul at? because that's my beef with the Smithsonian. When you force a narrative on people, at the end of the day, you're saying it was tough, but look, you're in the best place in the world. I don't buy that. So I wouldn't get rid of the worksheet. I would figure out a way to rework it. And then what would happen is finally, people might then say, no, we don't need to do that. We need to shut that down. Okay, that's the violence of forgetting. Is that the theory you're going to take to building a better society? Let's just pretend. And that may be the option. There are many people who argue that the violence of forgetting is the only way you can have a future society. Just forget the stuff and start forward. But I don't think that's why we're here tonight.
That was a group of history teachers.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And I just want to mention, since we're here at Howard, and it was, thank you, Dr. Bond, for the question. Just also here at Howard, we have, there's Africa Access that has an incredible project to make sure that children starting at pre-K challenge the stereotypes of Africa, which really contribute to that, allow that American exceptionalism. Because if every young child reads a book that Africa, it's wild animals, it's savages, literally, if you ask children today. And so the work of Africa Access that's based here at Howard is extremely important. I encourage every teacher here to check it out and share the website. We had one question back here. Again, remember to introduce yourself. Yeah.
There's a very prevalent myth in our country that we became a wealthy country because people work really hard and we're industrious and so on. But I think there's very little understanding of the fact that the source of capital that developed industrialization in our country was the slave trade, the production of cotton for the mills and so on, and that the North and South economies before, during, and after the war were very connected. And could you speak a little bit about sort of that whole economic piece and why that's important?
Well, what's your name? I'm sorry.
Introduce yourself.
Chi. All right. Nice to meet you. Yes, pleasure.
And Gene is actually writing a musical about
Oh,
Reconstruction.
Gene, you right? Oh, really? What's the idiom? What music?
It's spoken word,
Nice.
rhyme, rhythm, whatever.
Focus on labor, like a lot of issues.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Carney, want to take this?
Oh, yeah. Let me just say, I'll get out of the way very quickly. I think, thinking about Dr. Bond's question again. One of the pros of slavery, it created black people. No, seriously. Michael Gomez in his book is Changing Our Country Marks. The Bambara in Louisiana, for example, they wouldn't even deal with other people who didn't speak their language during enslavement. What happens over the arc of enslavement is people began to, as he says, exchange their country marks. The Vesey Rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina, they had regiments divided by nationality, and they had one for the Negroes who were born here because they didn't trust them. Y'all been born here. In other words, when you create an ethnicity called African American, that's only because of enslavement. The Igbo women at Montpelier might have probably poisoned James Madison's grandfather. But if you see what happened in Montpelier, I was just down there, they were doing this whole question about slavery, this curriculum, trying to work on this thing about Montpelier, James Madison's place, right? The argument becomes that the woman, James Madison's grandmother, I guess it is, who comes there is in a state of kind of unfree labor married to her husband. And when her husband is killed, they put the 3 Africans on trial for poisoning him. They killed one of them. They put one to death, but he wasn't at that plantation. The 2 women who the Madison family owned, they not only get off, they began to walk around the plantation like they got some nominal freedom, leading the people at Montpelier to speculate that they were in on it with the wife. Anyway, these are people who negotiating for their freedom in an unfree labor arrangement. Now, capitalism, of course, and in fact, one of the guys was down, who wrote The Half Has Never Been Told? Edward Baptiste. He was down there when we had this conversation last month. When you put enslavement in a global context in terms of finance capital and capitalism, everything from insurance companies to the commodities that are being exchanged to the fact that the Haitian Revolution upends the whole thing for Napoleon because sugar is the drug. I mean, sugar and coffee, those 2 drugs come and you see the whole thing change, right? The question becomes, can we continue to talk about capitalism as a form of government that is best suited for human beings? Because what happens during Reconstruction? They pass that 14th Amendment, and within the space of the period from the time they pass it until the first decade of the 20th century, the railroad companies figure out, we can use this for us. And so when you see everything from the civil rights cases to the slaughterhouse cases, and you come past Plessy up into the 20th century, what you begin to see is they create a fictitious human being called a corporation. And if you've been following C-SPAN, you can go listen to this civil rights cases stuff, and one of the legal scholars makes the point that even that was based on a misreading, a deliberate misreading of Supreme Court jurisprudence to argue that corporations were people. They never said that. But on that legal fiction, based on a lie, here we are in 2018, where corporations have speech, where racism can get pushed if you can pay for it. And if you go back to Reconstruction, for one brief shining moment, we had a possibility with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of establishing a form of government that could have broken the back of capital and capitalism. And I think that is where we see the possibility of two things. Number one, the United States, if it's going to be truly exceptional, going in another direction, because this is before the Russian Revolution, right? So by the time you get to 1917 and the Bolsheviks are coming forward, black people in this country ain't never had no problem with collective work. Neither have a lot of poor people. But Reconstruction is before Marx can get a hold of it, although Marx writes about it, although kind of broadly. Reconstruction is a model we can study for perhaps how we could begin to create social arrangements that could transcend capitalism. And then we don't have to reverse engineer any of that stuff. We can look at what we were trying to do, the farmers co-ops, the colored farmers co-ops, the black and white diffusion movement. That becomes an opportunity. I think Reconstruction becomes an opportunity to imagine what a world could look like without theorizing it, just going back and say, this is what they did until capital intervened.
I want to take a very different slant. I think it can be unprovable and maybe even dangerous to identify capitalism as the key problem in racism, okay? And I would suggest that Marx said the same thing, just for the record. I'm going to hide behind Marx, if you will. For example, he wrote what amounts to an entire book. In fact, it's a pretty thick book called Marx and Engels on the Civil War in America. He saw capitalism as a step up from slavery. He would identify slavery as more feudalism than capitalism. And it works, and I want to suggest this to you because I think if teachers who are teaching anti-racism get identified as also anti-capitalism, they will get dismissed by most people who work, who work in a capitalist economy, and who are not ready to jettison capitalism. And so I think that's dangerous pedagogically, but I also think it's not even correct historically, and it works kind of like this. And of course you can disagree with me, and I showed you my email, and you can disagree with me to me. But a capitalist wants to hire the best person for the job, okay, at the cheapest price, okay? Now, that could mean a black person. And there are lots of instances during Reconstruction and even during this interregnum period between 1876 and 1890 and thereafter for a little while, when capitalists did do things like that. Okay? I can tell you all kinds of towns, I mean a number of towns, where it was the capitalists that kept the town from going sundown. Okay? Now you can do this for the worst reasons. For example, you can hire black strikebreakers in your mine. And that's of course using racism in a capitalistic, you're not hiring the best person necessarily, but you're hiring them to undercut the other folks, and then you're actually creating racism or increasing racism in the working class. So there's no doubt that capitalism can make use of racism, and I'm not claiming that the opposite for a moment, but there is a slight, always there, but slight pressure for the capitalist to hire the best person for the job. So when they listen to this, a good capitalist will therefore hire a woman for a job that has only been done by men before, or will hire a black for a job that's only been done by whites before. And there are lots of cases where this happens. That's partly why the Republican Party was anti-racist during capitalism. I mean, during Reconstruction is what I meant to say, and for some time thereafter. So I think it's too simple to just identify racism and capitalism. The labor movement, including even the socialist labor movement, I'll give you one specific Maryland example. Mother Jones chose to be buried in a cemetery in a sundown town. Okay? She was terrible on race. She was very good on capital, very good on labor. but she was not good on race. And that's true for a number of left-wingers. So I don't want to see you guys, by that I mean you K-12 teachers or anybody else, get pinned into the position. You can teach it as a possibility, but if you say, well, capitalism is racist, look at the Republican Party. And if you look at the Republican Party today, you absolutely got a good case in point. But if you look at it in 1867, if you look at it, it's not so clear. So I just want to muddy that up a little.
Okay. And actually, I also think we're surrounded by a group of teachers that don't put forward facts as much as encourage students to read and come to their own conclusions. Exactly. So this is actually a great question about the relationship of racism and capitalism. We just want to mention that Dr. Banks is passing out our closing evaluation. We really need your comments. So we'll continue with one or two more questions, but we do want to make sure you take the time to fill that out. So as she's passing those out here, I think Eddie Becker, and you want to introduce yourself and also say a little bit who you are. Yeah.
Eddie Becker, I made my career in Washington, D.C. doing research, and then I got into doing research in Adams Morgan on the history of slavery and did the chronology on the history of slavery that's on the internet, and then wound up my lectures and went to the Society for Cincinnati, which is kind of like the instrument that was used to spread the empire and conquer the indigenous people and basically find enslaved people to do the work. And now I'm a docent there reinterpreting the space. And one of the murals they have is of the woman who funded the building of the Anderson House, which is just less than DuPont Circle. And she's in the middle of this Civil War scene with the burning of Fort Sumter and Lawrence Anderson's father is these are founding Republicans, and she's in the middle of this scene holding a bolt of cotton. And so I had to, how do I interpret that? And as it turns out, she inherits an untold fortune, becomes probably the world's richest woman when she was 13, from her grandfather who controlled the shipping out of Boston Harbor. And that was, of course, during this Industrial Revolution. It was mainly textiles. So it became logical that they didn't want to lose their source of raw materials, and so one of the reasons she's holding the cotton is that was what the price was. They couldn't grow it in the north, and cotton was king in that period of time. Now the question is, if they were so invested in slavery and indirectly out of these northern lands, why weren't they also pro-slavery? Or if they were pro-slavery, why had they been Republican? And then I did some investigation, and of course it was a kind of a wing of the Republican Party formed soon after the Fugitive Slave Law went into effect in 1850. Then that meant the Underground Railroad had to go all the way to Canada, on their way to Canada, captured by U.S. Marshals and bounty hunters, put into a jail in Wisconsin, freed by people calling themselves abolitionists soon afterwards.
Yes, they have a mural in Milwaukee that shows the whole thing. That's right. Black Park Center. That's right.
The founding of the Republican within Wisconsin in 1854. And this is the abolitionist wing. But there was another wing of the Republican Party. And let's just say they had an economic interest in this continuation of a policy that would, lead them into this various wars and other ways of looking at raw materials. The South, they saw, the South couldn't do industry because of a certain defect in the way water worked there. Why didn't getting to a summary of it is that the abolitionists, after emancipation, their issues, they went on to other issues.
Yeah.
And the people who had this economic vision of the future of the United States, there's a second mural in this room, and you're all invited.
Yeah. So definitely, don't give away the whole tour. Yeah, definitely, and also Eddie does a tour of Adams Morgan, which is also very good. So yeah, definitely check those out.
So I think that there is to follow the money and look at how that is.
Right, and also some of the lessons, the role plays that we'll share the links with everybody here, help students get into that. What was the role of the abolitionists, of the women's movement, the labor movement during Reconstruction? So we're supposed to wrap up at 7:50, so I'm just going to ask both our speakers just to say a few closing words, and then we want time for you to Oh, okay, really, okay, really, so your question will be the closing words. You're going to give the most
Thank you.
concise answers we've ever heard.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's right.
Thank you.
I
And
appreciate that.
introduce yourself, too.
I will. So my name is Danielle Martin. I work at Washington International School. I'm a Howard alum. And so my question is simple but a little bit complex. And so here I am sitting amongst these great minds, not just here but clearly in the audience, right? And so I'm like basically overwhelmed with this wealth of information that is coming from this very brief moment in history, right? So like. As an educator, right, as a person who went to Howard, right, who thought I knew what it meant to be an African-American woman, clearly not, right, been sitting in this year, right? So there's still so much, it's a period that's so pregnant, right? And so my question is, as someone who wants to, one, to get it right, and then two, to not necessarily get my students on board, because I think you're very right, they can relate to just about anything, but to get my peers involved, right? Where do I begin? And I mean that in a very I'm grateful for all the resources and grateful for all that, but where do I, as a person who's tried to learn about what it means to get other people on board with this historic reality, right, that we currently have, where do I start? It's outside of getting a PhD in Reconstruction.
Yeah, you don't have time to
And
do
before
that.
they answer, I'm going to actually ask one of the things is some of the resources. Pat, I'm going to ask if people might want to get the resources, the books we have. Do you mind scooting out and being by the book table? Thanks. Okay. Sorry. The only way I knew how to do that. So people can purchase some of the books that we had, including some by Dr. Lowen for signing, right, before you leave.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. So if you could both answer that just very briefly, because then we do need to wrap up.
Well, in that NEA series that I mentioned, I wrote a page and a half on how to teach Reconstruction. You can't have a shorter introduction. You've never written a shorter introduction than that. So you might start there, and I'm not being stupid about it. I mean, that's really short, and I know people are very busy, some busier than I. Second of all, in this other book I mentioned that I wrote, Teaching What Really Happened, I have a chapter on how to teach Reconstruction. And so you might try that. It's only 20 pages. There are ways, I would teach the word historiography. I've taught the word historiography to 5th graders. They can handle it fine. You know the word historiography? A lot of people are going, no, I don't. Historiography means the history of history, if you will, or the study of history. Like, who wrote this? This being a textbook. Who didn't write this? When was it written? What difference does that make, okay? With regard to these Confederate monuments, for instance, that we are now getting down, we hope. Who put this up and when and why, okay? The why of it, how come his graph has to do with writing, right, autograph and so on. So why is history written the way it was? Why was it written so badly between 1890 and 1940? 5th graders can understand that word, I know because I've taught it to them, and it empowers them to think critically about their textbook, about whatever you read and are foisting on them, about whatever I've written, and you're foisting my work on them, or Greg, or whatever, okay? And I have one other thought I want to make, but that's...
That's our closing here. Yeah.
I'll just say real quickly, Danny, that one of the things we tried to do in Philadelphia for about 17 years, Philadelphia Freedom Schools, well, quickly, resources. Got the website, go to ZenEd, Teach for Change, you'll see the materials, right? But materials come alive when we can talk about them. Study group, 2 words, study groups. In other words, teachers who, we were talking about the question of capitalism, socialism. W.E.B. Du Bois gave a very important talk to school teachers at Johnson C. Smith University one summer 1960, where they're now and why. It's like a 12-page essay. We talk. Get some teachers together, maybe during lunch, or let everybody read and talk, and then begin to talk about how you can make that happen. That does 2 things. Number 1, it engages the text. Now you're thinking. And number 2, we're building a learning community. What we found in Freedom Schools, we assigned a book one summer. We have about 250 high school students whose jobs were to go into elementary school classrooms and teach the little children with a college student there. And then once a week, we would pull them out to have them read the book. But every summer, we would pick the book together. One summer, we read Mary Frances Berry's book, My Face is Black is True, which is about Callie House and the ex-slaves mutual pension and relief fund, she and Isaiah Dickerson. This is during Reconstruction and right after. High school, elementary school, middle school teachers in a study circle once a week, having a conversation, erases this fictional division between academics and practitioners. Teaching is the highest profession in any society, as far as I'm concerned, because it's what prepares the society to replicate itself. Teachers in conversation around a text, sitting there and listening to these teachers, I learned more than in any graduate school class I ever had or any class I've ever taught. Listening to teachers think through ideas and then figure out how to make that real. So a simple study group of 3 people around an article you pick that comes out the website, watch that whole thing begin to open up. To me, that's a very practical thing, and it's just from my experiences.
I actually think that's a beautiful way to close, with the idea of us being in conversation and continuing this conversation. I'd like to shout out again to Dr. Banks, to Joy Banks, everybody here from Howard University, from the School of Ed, for making this event possible. Joy, any closing words or instructions as we